Just recently I went to see 2 films for International Cinema Day. Sitting inside the 2 gentlemen who did a lot of heavy breathing next to me in the stench of mid-August sweat in the air, I found myself really enraptured by a film called 3,000 Years of Longing. The film tells the stories of a djinn and the journey from owner to owner in separate self-contained stories which he relays to Tilda Swinton. I thought the set design was very ornate and interesting and the acting was obviously great, but what really drew me to the film was its rather unusual structure. Most of the film is centering on those stories about the history of Idris Elba's character, and it tended to be quite voiceover heavy. Each segment begins with the title card, and other than featuring the djinn, is self-contained. It's an anthology film through and through, and it was great. That begs the question though, why aren't portmanteau films made as often anymore? Okay, portmanteau, what does that mean? Well, the word has this very long and complicated history that is as follows. All you need to know is how it relates to film. It's a piece containing several separate but thematically linked narratives, which, yeah, sounds a lot like an anthology. The difference being that the latter tends to be directed by different people per segment, although I've seen a lot of conflicting ideas about this and examples of portmanteaus that are directed by different directors. My definition would be that an anthology film's sections needn't necessarily be linked in any thematic or narrative way, though. This website here cites the first portmanteau film to be 1924's The Crazy Ray, directed by René Clair, which is comprised of 4 different stories about Paris freezing over. It's a framing device that lends itself to horror, as evidenced by Dead of Night, Tales from the Crypt, Creepshow, Trick or Treat, the VHS franchise, and a bunch of others. The genre is a good fit for portmanteau in the same way that a television series like The Twilight Zone is, because the best horror stories tend not to be especially long. They're novellas or a segment from an anthology of other stories. And so if you adapt them into a feature film, chances are you'll be adding a lot of filler. If the story is just a section in a portmanteau, however, confined to 20 or 30 minutes, you can still build a lot of tension and deliver a great horror story without having to worry about cinematic conventions like making it to 90 minutes. Of the movies I listed, I would probably say Trick or Treat is the best. It can get a bit tryhardy with how cool it wants you to think it is, like a lot of 2000s media, but the framing device is an interesting one and the stories themselves are pretty fun. Dead of Night is considered perhaps the most renowned horror portmanteau, or even just portmanteau in general. From what I've heard, it did a lot for the genre and helped horror become a mainstay of anthology, which is more than could be said for Twilight Zone. Right up there with other classics from 1983 like Porky's 2. Twilight Zone the movie probably isn't as bad as I make it out to be, but it's certainly quite close. There were some massive directors attached to this project. Joe Dante, Spielberg, John Landis. Hell, even George Miller, who directed 3,000 Years of Longing, has a segment. The form factor of a portmanteau seems like it would work perfectly well for the source material, but a mix of sloppy pacing, bad acting, a lack of thematic cohesion between stories, and actual real-life results in a film that arguably scared Hollywood away from portmanteaus for a good while. Whilst we may not get any big-budget anthology films anymore, that's certainly not to say there aren't any made in general. I of course mentioned Trick or Treat before, and that's attained a relatively massive cult following since it was released. Wild Tales feels a bit like half a dozen half-baked Tarantino scripts stitched together at times, but I personally thought it was quite fun, and it too has gained a fanbase. You've got Netflix throwing some money at a portmanteau with whatever it's called. I mean, I haven't seen it, but I'm told it's not very good, so take that for what you will. The most high-profile portmanteau to come out in the last decade is probably The Ballad of Buster Scruggs, directed by the Coens. I think anthologies suit Joel and Ethan's writing style quite well, and it was a big critical success. Weirdly enough, it was also distributed by Netflix. I think that anthologies pair well with streaming, in the same way that limited series have become far more prominent on them than they were on television. You know which of the most famous movies of all time is a portmanteau, though? Kinda. It is heavily debated by film fans as to whether Pulp Fiction actually counts as a portmanteau. On the one hand, yeah, it's got a handful of different stories that are all centered around the film's namesake, and all in all they're relatively detached from one another. On the other hand though, they do share characters and events, and one story will be referenced in another. You could argue it's one self-contained narrative that's just ordered non-chronologically like a Christopher Nolan film. Like Batman Forever. My take? I mean, there are plenty of portmanteaus where a character carries over from segment to segment, or is the point that ties every story together. So I don't think it's too far of a stretch to call Pulp Fiction a portmanteau. And if that's anything to go by, I would say that even if portmanteaus aren't made very frequently anymore, that's not to say they don't have a huge impact on film. A lot of them are considered both immensely important to the art form, revolutionary even, as well as just really good movies within their own right. Which is to say, backed up by the release of 3,000 Years of Longing, I don't think they'll be going anywhere anytime soon. Unless they do another Twilight Zone movie, and if they are, I'd like to recommend a great director for the project, Hannibal Lecter.